Hello and welcome to this webinar delivered by the ISM Trust. I am Maria Visitiu and I am Member Engagement and Events Officer at the ISM. And today I am joined by Jayne Price for this webinar on developing a cultural understanding about music in the classroom. Before we begin, I have a few points for you. If you experience any technical difficulties such as sound quality, please let us know in the chat box and we'll make attempts to resolve the issue. The webinar is being recorded and will be available to view on the ISM's website at ism.org/webinars. If you have any questions, please let us know in the questions box and we'll make attempts to answer as many of them as possible at the end. Now, without further ado, I will hand over to Jayne for the presentation. I hope you enjoy.
Thank you, Maria. Hello, everybody. I'm really pleased to talk to you this afternoon. I'm just going to share my screen and presentation. Okay. So, my name is Jayne Price. I work at the University of Huddersfield, and I'm presenting to you today from my doctoral research, which was based on data collected from 50 pupils from minority ethnic backgrounds, based in 3 schools. And I interviewed 14 heads of music in schools with diverse pupil populations and 4 music hub leads. And so the data that I'm going to present to you today are the findings, and I'm really focusing on the curriculum in terms of the repertoire. So over time, I think there's been really strong advocacy for the power of music education in terms of developing cultural understanding. And this is something that I've always been quite skeptical about in some ways. So in the national curriculum, it's written large in terms of music being able to support understanding of music from different places, different countries, different times, and through listening and learning that music, then we can learn something about the people that make it. And so the national curriculum asks us to the problem is the national curriculum asks us to listen with discrimination to the best in the musical canon, and listen and evaluate and review music across a wide range of historical periods, genres and styles, and the works of the great composers and musicians. And what this means is that Western music is placed at the centre of the formal music curriculum, Western art music. And by teaching the best, and we all know that what that is interpreted as, what we're really doing is naively proposing an equitable music curriculum that is representative, but actually it represents a really narrow cultural perspective. And I'm interested to see the impact of that on pupils that we work with. So the way that that has been interpreted in terms of developing cultural musical understanding is by the inclusion of world music. And again, I'm putting world music in inverted commas there. And that's been the primary way that music teachers have addressed the notion of cultural understanding. But obviously there's a problem with world music, because immediately it sets up this notion of the canon, and that's interpreted as a Western music art tradition, and then everything else is lumped in together as world music. And it reinforces some of the stereotypes. I think, when we generally think about cultural understanding and we're talking about the context, when that's done badly, then it reinforces stereotypes that undermine the cultural understanding that we're actually trying to develop. And the problem is that when we do include music from different parts of the world, we actually focus on it in terms of its comparison to Western music, or we focus on it through a Western lens. The notion of evaluating music from different times and places sets up that sort of comparison between Western art music and different kinds of music. So I think there are problems with that approach to the curriculum and music education. So in terms of the purpose of the research, I wanted to really look at the impact of the way that we teach music across all different platforms, in terms of the formal music curriculum. So I'm looking at music in the school curriculum, but also thinking about that in terms of the formal music tuition through music hubs, etc., that engage with schools. And I'm looking at the impacts I'm really thinking about the differential participation in music provision between the white majority pupil population and minority ethnic pupil populations, and that lots of other studies have shown that differential participation is manifest in extracurricular activities, in GCSE entries, and certainly music study in higher education. And so the sort of underlying sort of thought behind the research really is that it's about this notion that music education has got to be reshaped and democratised in order to secure engagement and nurture talented pupils from a range of diverse backgrounds. And there's increasing publications that support that notion, that we need to actually do something about the music curriculum, and that's why it's so sad in some ways that the model music curriculum reinforces some of the things that I've been talking about. Okay, so my research questions for the doctoral were these that you've got in front of you there. So I was really interested in what the experiences and perceptions pupils had that impacted really on their participation in music provision, and I wanted to have a look at how teachers conceive and operationalise their pedagogy in terms of their response to cultural diversity. And I wanted to really focus in on the institutional cultures and practices that might impact on minority ethnic pupils' engagement and participation. So as I say, this session really focuses on music repertoire, as that's one of the areas that I was exploring and trying to understand pupils' curriculum experiences, and trying to think about that, how that might impact on their participation. So I'm going to talk about first the work that really came from the pupils' data, and I was asking them really about their thoughts about the curriculum that they were experiencing, and these are some of the things that they talked about. So I've picked out some really interesting bits of the data. So you'll see that I've actually pulled things from what the pupils actually said. So one of the things that came out was that they really wanted music teachers to broaden the repertoire that they engaged with in the classroom. And these were some of the reasons for that. So pupils actually said to me that they wanted to learn music from different parts of the world. They talked about that they didn't want to just focus on pop music. They called it, normal pop music, which I thought was interesting. But they wanted to learn about typical Black music. They were talking about music of Black origin. They wanted to really understand that music and where that came from. They talked about it being an opportunity for the pupils to listen to different music and the music that different pupils were interested in. And they wanted to sort of really broaden the repertoire because they were getting a diet of a similar sort of music all the way through. So in one of the schools that I went to, they were working on a musical futures approach. So they were working with pop music, but what's interesting about that is that they weren't really using the music that the pupils were interested in. And when they weren't doing the music in sort of small pop music groups, the music that the teacher introduced them to in terms of the listening material was, sort of quite Western classical orientated. So the pupils wanted a broad range of music to listen to. I asked the pupils about was it important to study music from their own cultural heritage, and they gave a really sort of sometimes really powerful testimony about that. So they talked about a culturally sustaining pedagogy. So they talked about it being really important that we studied music from their cultural backgrounds because they didn't want it to fade away. It deserves recognition. So they were, really keen to tell me that they wanted to listen to music and learn about music so that they could keep that music alive in some ways. They wanted also to learn about music that they connected with, and they connected with lots of different kinds of music, but they talked about that in terms of their cultural heritage as well. So they talked about cultural congruence, that the heritage, the experiences and points of references that they brought into the classroom, and they wanted to see that in the classroom as well. They did talk about cultural understanding. They thought that if they learnt music from different places, it would develop cultural understanding. And they thought that would also help them to understand their own heritage as well, again, which was interesting. So when they were talking about cultural understanding, they said things like, if you learn more from other people's cultures, it makes people more open-minded. They thought it was important that the teachers shared their own musical interests and backgrounds, and they also talked about learning lots of different music. So they want to know where the music from their cultural heritage, things about that, they want to know where it's come from, what it's made of, those sorts of things. So they were interested in musical context, but they also had this powerful sense of representation. So they talked about the fact that it was important that the music that they were learning, and in this case, the pupils that I was talking to were learning Indian classical instruments. They felt it was really important for that to be represented in the classroom. They really talked about the importance of learning how to play different instruments, and really important in terms of thinking about it's not just about sort of essentializing, if you like, the musical cultures that you think that they have and the musical interests that you think they might have, but also the music that they're really interested in, and that they talked about how they listen to music from their culture at home, but actually that's not totally the music that they were interested in, and they wanted to learn about other music. So this pupil said, I like listening to gypsy songs, and but I'm into hip hop, and all my friends listen to hip hop, and that's what I want to do in the classroom. And that brings me onto sort of another really key point, that what the pupils said is that they were really conscious of music teachers introducing them different music from different parts of the world as a static view, and they wanted us to realise that actually music from different countries, traditional music, is not the same as current music, if you like, that we need to be aware of. They were really aware of that world music was presented as steeped in tradition and static and fixed in time, and I think their teaching comes through in some of the things that they said. So we need to be thinking about current music from different parts of the world, and trying to introduce that as well. The pupils talked about learning about the context of music from different places, because it helps you learn more in terms of not being ignorant. They talked about developing cultural understanding in terms of awareness, and this sense of being more collaborative and open with each other, and it helps them to understand people more. So it's about learning about the context so that they can understand where the music comes from, but that in turn helps us to make relationships with each other. And all these things are interesting to me, because in terms of what the national curriculum says, in some ways the pupils are articulating it as well. But they were also extremely critical about the music education that they were receiving, particularly when teachers were talking about different kinds of music, because they really recognised a lack of confidence from the music teachers when they were introducing different sorts of music. So that I think that this quote is from the data is really interesting, because what they start to talk about is that teachers feel uncomfortable when talking about music that is connected with culture, if you like. So teachers sort of whitewash, if you like, how they introduce the music, and sometimes give very minimal discussion about some of the political context in which the music is created, and that uncomfortableness is quite obvious to the children. So the pupil 21 there says, even if they don't feel comfortable about teaching it, they could say, bring somebody in, for example, to do a workshop. They've got to teach it, but if you don't feel comfortable, they've got to at least try and teach it and pre-warn the students maybe, but they still think it needs to be taught. So they want to hear about some of the difficult political histories connected with music. Another way that they were critical in terms of the way that teachers teach music in the classroom is about the reductionist approach to music from different parts of the world. So they recognised tokenistic representation, and they also talked about a lack of respect in the music classroom. So this group of pupils, again, these were pupils learning Indian classical instruments, they said that indie music in particular was marginalised from the mainstream curriculum. And one pupil talked about the way that it was taught in their school. And this is a school actually that has instrumental teachers in Dole, in Tabla, but they also teach indie music in the classroom. So they said that there was a lack of detail in the syllabus and the learning materials. One of the pupils was talking about the indie music in the GCSE curriculum and how that often they said that information was incorrect in the way that the teacher delivered that. And when the teachers were playing the instruments, they felt that there was a lack of respect for the instruments. That when teachers are playing them, they don't play them correctly. And another thing that sort of came through in a slightly different discussion was about how the pupils who learnt the instruments were sort of wheeled out, if you like, for high days and holidays in terms of the school. So when schools were having, some sort of cultural celebration, and I obviously, from the tone of my voice, that I think that that's dodgy in its own sense, but asked to play at those sorts of events. And then they talked about how they were asked to play at open evenings, but they were very much separate from the rest of the music education that was going on. So, they would be playing in a corner, and the school band would be playing on the main stage, and actually never the two shall meet. And so they felt very separate from what else was going on in the extracurricular programme. Okay, so the next thing that they recognised that I thought was, really powerful was this fear of causing offence in terms of the teachers talking about political history and race issues in music. So they talked about how when they were learning the blues, for example, the music teachers would teach a little bit of the background, but it when you see some of the materials that are produced about blues music, you can see why music teachers do this, but really unable to talk in any deep way about the way that music was started and developed. And I think that comes out in what Pupil 22 is saying there. So he feels brave enough. He's got a really great relationship with his music teacher. He feels brave enough to say in the class, what about the African American slaves? And then she'll go like to him, is that appropriate for the classroom? And he says, well, I think it is. I'm pretty sure that it's something to do with blues music. It had something to do with blues music. But then he said the teachers skip over it. Now, I think that's interesting in a lot of ways because, the way he's talking about, the way he uses the word slaves there, which, is not right. And actually having that conversation with him might be an opportunity to discuss how we talk about that period. But in terms of the teachers sort of shutting it down and saying, is that appropriate for a classroom? They felt that was really sort of symptomatic of the teachers being frightened of causing offence, so therefore they don't talk about it. So he says that, I don't think they're saying it because you've said something wrong. They're saying it because they feel awkward about the situation. They don't know the answer to what you're saying. So the pupils really wanted to be able to have those sorts of discussions in the classroom, but actually often their music teachers didn't feel comfortable enough to do it. And they saw talking about that, particularly about the blues, that was the example that they gave, but they saw that as actually, promoting a positive image, and that actually, because it wasn't explored, there wasn't that opportunity to do so. And then this part of the data I thought was really fascinating. So I talked earlier about how the schools that I worked in were often using a musical futures approach. And one of the key parts of that is using music that the pupils feel interested in and want to learn to play. But the pupils that I spoke to were talking about the appropriateness of the music that they wanted to play and how ultimately the teacher decided whether it was appropriate or not. So they were talking about rap and hip hop music and wanting to do that in the classroom, but the teachers often say no because of some of the lyrics. It's not appropriate for the classroom, and the pupils saw that, and the pupils understood that concept. But I think Nate Holder's written a great a blog post about the hypocrisy of which hip hop is demonized by music teachers. He juxtaposes the sort of glamorized violence of hip hop with that in terms of the English curriculum and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's a great post if you go on his website and have a look at it. But that sort of feeling really came into the data, that they were very much told often that the music that they wanted to learn, they wanted to play, they couldn't because it wasn't appropriate for the classroom. So obviously I talked, as I said, to teachers as well as pupils, and some of the things that the pupils were talking about actually came into the teacher data as well. So the teachers' data articulated a lack of confidence in terms of teaching music, diverse range of music. They, when we were asked, talking about how they chose their curriculum, how they chose their repertoire, they talked about not wanting to patronise the students that they were teaching by making sure, for example, one teacher talked about we don't have a steel band just because we've got a lot of pupils from Caribbean backgrounds, and so that they're uncomfortable really in terms of articulating how they respond to pupils from diverse backgrounds when thinking about their curriculum. I found a degree of defensiveness in when teachers were talking about the curriculum that they chose. They talked about it's our job to give the pupils a broad spectrum. When thinking about teaching pupils to a diverse population, you shouldn't limit what you do. All pupils should learn the music, all of the music, so that they all get the same experience. And there was a distinct lack of critical thinking about the participation of pupils in their curriculum. So that quote there, you get very few ethnic minorities doing GCSE music. Again, uncomfortable language there of the way that they're talking about pupils. So in classes, in an average class, it's probably been about 20. There might have been one pupil from a minority ethnic background or a pupil of colour. And, putting that down to the fact that the pupils devalue it in terms of employment, or they see other subjects as more important. So it's a lack of critical thinking about what else might be impacting on engagement and participation. There's a degree of essentializing in terms of their understanding about the pupils that they were teaching. So, thinking that Romanian pupils absolutely love music when when teachers talk like that. They're thinking in terms of groups of pupils all doing the same thing. This notion of black pupils being good at music, I think sort of speaks to some of the essentialist thinking that has been written about quite extensively. I think what's more, well, equally, but hit me sort of quite strongly, if you like, is the value that teachers put on different kinds of music. So this quote from a music teacher was talking about drumming in particular, djembe playing in particular, and the pupils really enjoying that musical activity. But she saw that as a fun lesson. She didn't see it as a lesson that was really developing them musically. So she did the lesson after all the assessments had been done, just as a bit of fun at the end of term. And she articulated that in terms of the skills that activities like that gave the pupils compared with learning how to play the keyboard properly. So she was talking about 5-finger technique, etc. And learning how to play chords and understanding chord sequence. So you start to see here the different values placed on different kinds of music that comes through in terms of the national curriculum and certainly in terms of the model curriculum, that this is a range of music that is really going to give them the skills that they need, and actually we better do some of the other stuff as well. And teachers acknowledged that actually their lack of knowledge was part and parcel of their approach to teaching different kinds of music. So, one teacher talked about the Indian classical music and the GCSE syllabus being a swine to teach. And in the literature, it's there in terms of the music resources that teachers have had access to and their training that they've had access to. So there's often confusing and contradictory advice in terms of teaching a broad range of music. And there's this fear of offence that has been written about in terms of teaching different kinds of music, but without authenticity. So not having the instruments, for example, so therefore that you can't play that sort of music. So there's a distinct element of lack of teacher knowledge. The pupils talked about that, and the teachers talked about that as well. There's a notion of othering going on. So there is certainly in the with the music hub leads that I talked to, there's this notion of finding music teachers that could teach different instruments from different parts of the world being much more difficult than teaching Western music instruments, if you like. So this notion that those teachers are different to other teachers, and the notion that actually they don't teach the same. So again, this was largely connected to teachers of Indian classical music instruments, and this notion that actually the way in which those instruments are taught are not applicable in the current sort of either whole class instrumental teaching groups or in small groups. And that, I found that sort of really uncomfortable, that there was no sort of mention of training of, this is the way that we teach music as a hub, and we want everybody to be able to teach in that way. But also in terms of Indian musical instrument teachers being outside of the organisation. So if we want that sort of music teaching, then we'll hire an outside organisation to do that. And that, fundamentally, I think undermines, the fact that, why can't we learn all kinds of different instruments, and why is that outside of the mainstream? And talking to music hub leads in particular, there was a little bit of a lack of strategic thinking, I think, underlying things. So, we've got a teacher in one year, but then it's not sustainable. So, it doesn't exist anymore. We buy a pile of instruments, but then it's not sustainable, and they're sat in a corner. So that lack of strategic thought about how we can develop more inclusive practice is just not there, and that also comes out in a lack of data that's collected in terms of musical participation across pupil characteristics. So that data is either unavailable or there's difficulties in collecting that data, and inclusive music is not discussed in terms of the governance or accountability in terms of the pupils that it's, that our music, education is serving. So I think, across the data, there are some real things that impact on pupil participation. And I think in terms of the theory, and obviously you can look at the slides afterwards, so I'm not going to go into this in great detail. But in terms of the theory that underpins this, what the literature is talking about is the hegemony of Western classical art music, and how that, is inside everything that we do, and it underpins everything that we do, and therefore that sets up a particular discourse about music, that actually this is the most important music and everything else is somehow lesser to that. So that comes across in terms of the way that we talk about music notation as being extremely, sort of important, and the model curriculum really, that sort of emphasise it even more than it is emphasised actually in the national curriculum document. And lots of music of from different places, is not connected to Western classical notation, and therefore, I watched lessons where teachers were introducing samba with crotchets and quavers, flashcards and things like that. You play a certain sort of samba, don't you, if you're trying to play it with crotchets and quavers that pupils can actually read, and it takes you away from what the music should actually sound like. So this emphasis on musical literacy, venerates Western art music forms and structures, and the musical elements, and again everything else. If remember those words in the national curriculum, you evaluate music. Everything else might seem that it doesn't actually sort of stand up to scrutiny. So this sort of emphasis and hegemony of Western art music and the way that we think about that might be underlying some of the data that I've talked about earlier. So Western art music is legitimised through the processes of world music being compromised by bringing it into the classroom. Styles and genres and types are only the one kind of way of classifying music, and I'm highlighting units of work still, in existence on African music. We all understand that is a misnomer, but but the thought of, distinct units of work on particular kinds of music sets up this opportunity for essentializing that music and demeaning that kind of music. And it sets up this hierarchy, the superiority of Western art music compared with everything else. And that, flows also through assessment. So how do we assess music? We assess it through thinking about, high status music, high status knowledge, being about Western classical music. So those are some of the things that I think are, inherent in what I'm talking about. Okay, so what I'm really interested in is how that impacts on engagement. And I think that one of the things that it does is it shows music that music is sort of an elite option that might not necessarily be for them. And we, perpetuate that through higher education as well. So I'm going to leave that. I know I've not gone, into too much detail about that, but it is there on the slides, and that's why I wrote the slides so fully for you to have a look at afterwards. Obviously, in terms of my post, I'm interested in music teacher development, and obviously I'm interested in initial teacher training. So what I really want to do with this research in terms of going forwards is not just critique it, but think about ways forward and think about, okay, so what do we need to do? So we need to think about making our curriculum more inclusive. So, again, the theory underneath that might be about developing culturally responsive teaching. So it's about having high expectations of all pupils. It's about understanding and learning about the history and experiences of the pupils that you teach. And it's about, not being in that situation where you feel uncomfortable because you don't know the music that you're talking about. But it's also about being able to be critical about what you're doing and being proactive and challenging some of the assumptions that we're faced in terms of the national curriculum document, the model curriculum, in terms of curriculum materials that are available. But I also think it's about monitoring and evaluation. It's about thinking what is actually happening in my school, what is, who is participating, who is my musical curriculum, who's enjoying it, who's not enjoying it. So monitoring participation, I think, is a really important thing, and I think that has implications broadly in terms of music hub activity and also, the funders, the Arts Council that are funding that. So we need to be clear about what we're expecting. And it's about being critically reflective about the impact of the curriculum that you're using. So these are some of the ways that I think we need to do that. I think we need to think about how we can introduce musical mentoring for pupils in our schools. I think we need to diversify the curriculum. We need to critique the curriculum that we're offering. We need to use inclusive pedagogy, and we need to think about student voice and empowerment. And again, like I say, high quality monitoring evaluation. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of those things. So one of the things that I think is really important, and a concept of usualizing and actualizing. So the reason why I've used that term usualizing and made a word up, I suppose, is about making thinking about the way that we talk about music, the way that we show music, the way that we, sort of think about music when we're, deciding what repertoire to use. We need to normalize, if you like, a diverse approach to that. So, how do we show pictures of musicians in our classroom, and just making it usual to be diverse in our approach. So one of the things that might happen, of course, is rather than doing a unit of work on a particular type of music, is when you're talking about an aspect of music, say you're teaching rhythm, for example, that actually it is usual to include music from different parts of the world when you do that. So the examples that you choose, are diverse, and that is the usual way that you introduce different concepts in the music curriculum. So you're acclimatizing music, the pupils, to the presence of a diverse music education, if you like. So teachers use materials that span diversity without inviting further comment or reaction. It's that sense that we want to see this as usual rather than normal, if you like. So but alongside that, picking up on some of the pupils' data, we need to have some actualising lessons where we do talk about political history and thinking about how that's impacted on pupils with different identities. We need to diversify the curriculum. So, we need to think about how we can replace our Eurocentric view with a world view. Pupils that need to be included both intellectually and socially and culturally, but without having to conform to the dominant culture. And we need to think about how we can sort of critically reflect on those musical givens that I've talked about in terms of the dominance of Western art music. So we also need to challenge those assumptions in terms of cultural identity, both in terms of the music that we think pupils will be interested in, but also, some of that essentializing stuff that I talked about in terms of which pupils are going to be great at music and which pupils are not going to be great at music. And we need to think about, other things like, in terms of our assessment processes, can we change the way that we think about assessment in music? Is it about, pupils getting better and judged in terms of their own performance and how that gets better over time? And then, of course, we need to really think about challenging the structures, the hegemonic structures that maintain that status quo in the curriculum. So we need to be able to explore with the pupils why certain music, why certain composers are privileged and whose voices are missing. We need to be able to have that confidence to engage with issues that are around political or oppressive contexts. And it's really about deep thinking as teachers. So becoming more aware of our values and beliefs and how that might impact on pupils. And again, picking up on what the pupils were saying, it's having that confidence to set up that environment where pupils can confidently express their opinions and ask challenging questions of us and the music that we choose to introduce to them. Okay. So I'm going to stop now and pause, just in case there's anybody's got any questions. But I wanted to leave you with this quote from one of the pupils that I spoke to. I think developing culturally responsive pedagogy in music really involves understanding the music that pupils have affinity with. And I'm really not meaning the music that actually is part of their cultural heritage. I'm meaning the music that they really have affinity. So talking to the pupils about what they're interested in is really important. But more than anything else, it's about shifting the sort of Eurocentric view to focus on that broad music in the broadest sense, and that we don't see one type of music as being more important than the other, and that involves more, it's the underneath things that underpin that rather than the things that are particularly obvious. So that's the end of the presentation. I'm really happy to take questions. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and then we can just see if there's any questions, Maria.
Thank you very much. We haven't received any questions just yet, so if anyone out there has any questions for Jayne, please let us know either in the chat box or in the Q&A box, whichever you prefer. We can pick them up from either. One of our questions was in the research that you've done and interviews with schools and students, have you had any schools that have tried to diversify their syllabus and curriculum, and kind of what steps have they taken? Or
Okay, so I think that's a really interesting question. I collected the data a couple of years ago now, so 2018-19, and at that time, I think in some cases I was really raising awareness. So one of the teachers from the music hub said to me, do you know, now we've talked about it, I've never thought about it like that before. I'm gonna do something about the data and just see if I can work out how we can collect the data and how I can do some thinking about this. But I think actually we've moved on quite significantly in some ways. Although I have to say, looking at the model curriculum, maybe I take that back. But I think, because of the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, people are a little bit more politically aware and are thinking about this agenda in a little bit more detail, and therefore I suspect now that there is a little bit more thinking about this. But what I also suspect is that people don't quite know how to do it yet, and I think we need much more guidance and much more help about the strategies that we can actually use to do it. And I don't think we're quite there yet, and I don't think I'm quite there yet in terms of what I'm saying. I think the further work that I want to do is with teachers and thinking about, okay, let's think about how we can actually put some of these things into action and really make a difference.
of course, yes. As I said, if there's any questions, please put them in the chat. I know we've covered a lot of ground, so if there are any questions, come to you after the end of the webinar, you can email it to us. A good email address is membership@ism.org, and we can forward them to Jayne. Do you have any idea of a good place where teachers could go for some
Okay, if I don't leave you with anything, you must go and look at Nate Holder's blog site. He is, really talking about these issues and publishing material that really helps. Nate's work is really powerful. I think I read some of his stuff and thought, well, there's my doctor, my doctor. I'm not sure what I've got to add on top of that. So that's a really accessible and down to earth place to start, I think. That in terms of what's out there. In terms of journal articles and stuff, the person that's written quite a lot about the sort of hegemony of Western art tradition is Gary Spruce. So there is stuff out there, but Nate's work is very current and very accessible.
Sure, perfect, thank you. So we seem to have received a couple of questions. First question is it possible for music teachers to separate themselves from their curriculum?
I think, what an interesting question. I think, okay, so part of me thinks that we have to think outside the box, if you like. So, you know, I think there's a real connection to, because it's self-perpetuating. So the vast majority of music teachers have come through the system themselves, if you like. So the system, you know, is all about, you know, that hegemony of the Western classical tradition is there in the system, and because most of us have come through that system, it's really hard to start thinking from a slightly different perspective. But to me, that's about you know, being critical about how that might impact on the children that we're teaching. And I think, you know, to a certain extent, it's our duty to upskill ourselves in areas that we, you know, we might not be knowledgeable in originally. But you know, ensuring that you do that properly and not in a tokenistic way, so that you know, sort of 3 or 4 facts that you regurgitate to the pupils, if that makes sense. I'm not trying to be, you know, sort of glib or insulting, but you know, teachers are really busy, and sometimes, you know, you need a quick fix. But that's what leads to some of the, you know, sort of tokenistic ways that we teach, you know, diverse range of music. But, you know, essentially we need to be, you know, we need to put ourselves in the curriculum, but we also need to talk to pupils about how they want to put themselves in the curriculum, if you like, and you know, do both, if that makes sense. I'm not sure I've totally answered your question, but it's a really interesting thing to think about.
Sure. Um, we've got another question that says, do you have any thoughts about how composing new music can come into a culturally diverse music curriculum?
I think it's about, I suppose that I could answer that by thinking about a broad range of musical influences, if you like. So, you know, if you introduce pupils to a broader palette of music, then that enables them to think about composition in a slightly different way, perhaps, or introduce things into their curriculum, you know, their composition that, you know, is inspired from different times and places. In terms of looking at fusion and the way that music in different parts of the world, you know, current music, you know, embodies a lot of different influences from everywhere. You know, I think that, you know, that can sort of impact on the way that people think about composition. So yeah, that would be my sort of off the cuff answer to that.
Sure, perfect. Thank you very much. Well, it seems we're not getting any other questions, which is great because we're right on time at 7 o'clock. So thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in with us today. Just a quick reminder that the webinar, the recording will be available hopefully from tomorrow on our website, which is ism.org/webinars. And if you want to find out any more about ISM membership benefits or anything that the ISM can assist you with, you can check out our website, which is ism.org. So once again, thank you very much, Jayne, for
Thank you for listening, everyone.
No problem, and thank you everyone for tuning in, and I hope to see you at some other ISM events soon. So thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.